Now, get comfortable and let the noise of the day fade as we step back into the age of the Vikings. These were people who believed that dying in battle was not a tragedy, but a victory. To fall with a weapon in hand meant you had lived correctly, and yet, hidden beneath all that confidence and steel, there was something rarely spoken about, a quiet pause, a subtle fear, one that made even the toughest Vikings change course without a word. You see, a Viking warrior was not supposed to feel fear, not in front of family, not in songs, not with an enemy standing close enough to smell. Their world left no room for doubt. Courage was expected, like rowing a ship or bleeding without complaint. To feel afraid was to fail before the fight even began. From the stories shared beside flickering fires, you learned of heroes who sailed into violent storms, fought men twice their size, and faced death with a calm smile. Fear, they said, belonged to monks watching their churches burn. For Vikings, fear was just a passing thought, quickly crushed by action. Their thinking was simple. If something worried you, you attacked it. If you died, you were rewarded with Valhallenless feasts, endless stories, endless glory. Dying quietly in bed was the worst ending imaginable. No warrior wanted to be remembered as someone who lived bravely, only to fade away unnoticed. This belief shaped everything they did. You can see it in the records left behind. Vikings mocked kings, shouted insults at armies, and treated tall walls as small problems, not real barriers. Even when they lost, they rarely admitted it. Blame was placed on bad luck, trickery, or someone else's mistake. Fear was never mentioned. That's why certain stories stand out so sharply. In a few rare moments, the bold tone disappears. The words become careful. Places are named once, then avoided. No heroic speeches, no great final battles, just silence. And in Viking stories, silence is loud. It signals something went wrong, something no one wanted to explain. Remember, these were people who crossed oceans in open ships, facing armored knights without hesitation. They believed fate was already decided, so worrying was pointless. You met destiny head-on or not at all. Yet there was one group whose lands they rarely entered, one people they did not chase eagerly. Their names spread quietly, without exaggeration or bragging. No wild tales, no boasts of victory, just distance. The fear was not obvious. It didn't shout or threaten. It simply nudged the ship's bow in another direction. And when a culture that welcomes death starts to hesitate, something has gone very wrong. What unsettled them was not battle itself. If Vikings feared fighting, they would have stayed home. Instead, they built longships, sharpened blades, and sailed straight toward danger. Fighting made sense to them. Violence had rules. You could see your enemy, count them, measure the risk. Even losing had a logic to it, a swing, a block, a scream. But what truly disturbed them was what they could not read or predict. Not skilled warriors, but situations where strength, numbers, and confidence meant nothing. They feared places where the land itself worked against them. Viking battles were meant to be loud. Shields crashing, men shouting, drums beating. Noise meant control. So when there was only quiet, it felt wrong. Silence meant eyes watching from somewhere unseen. And then there were the moments that never became battles at all. Imagine stepping onto unfamiliar shore, moving inland, sensing you are being watched, yet seeing no one, no scouts, no villages, no clear enemy, only endless forest and snow, tracks that vanished, arrows that came without sound. strikes without warning. And before you could react, nothing. Just silence again. This type of conflict was deeply frustrating to a Viking. They preferred opponents who stood their ground long enough to be struck. They respected raw strength. It was something they understood. But this was impolite. This felt like cheating. It felt less like warfare and more like a slow, insidious bullying by the very land itself. Their weapons, their armor, their shields, all heavy, all incredibly effective on open terrain, where charges could be mustered and lines could be held. But when movement became labored, when visibility diminished, and when sounds played tricks on their ears, all that formidable equipment suddenly felt less like an advantage and more like an exhausting burden. The once fearless warrior would find himself sweating, disoriented, his gaze darting suspiciously at every shadow, every tree. This wasn't a form of cowardice, no. It was a potent blend of frustration and a chilling realization. Their usual methods of brute force were utterly failing, and Vikings detested problems that couldn't be solved with a well-aimed punch. They didn't fear dying in battle. They feared the profound waste of effort on battles that steadfastly refused to happen. So, when the sagas indicate Vikings began to steer clear of certain territories, it wasn't due to any perceived weakness on their part. It was because those lands simply wouldn't engage them in a proper, understandable fight. And that, for a Viking, was entirely unacceptable. They were extraordinary travelers, yet even they perceived unspoken edges to their known world. Not literal cliffs where longships plunged into oblivion, though that would have been entirely in character, but rather psychological boundaries. Places where the familiar lines on maps blurred, where directions dissolved into mere guesswork, and where their unwavering confidence quietly, almost imperceptibly, packed its bags and slipped away. Beyond these ethereal edges lived a people known as the Sami. From a Viking viewpoint, the Sami weren't just geographically distant. They were, in every sense, inconveniently. And as you drift deeper into this calm narrative, imagine the vast, silent stretches of land that awaited them. Picture dense, ancient forests, so thick and still that they seemed to drink up every whisper, every sound, leaving behind only a profound quiet. Then visualize the tundra, an expanse where the ground beneath your feet might appear firm, solid, only to give way unexpectedly, a silent betrayal. And beyond that, the endless snowfields, stretching in every direction, each vista mirroring the last, leaving you without a familiar landmark. You see, the Vikings, with their longboats and coastal raids, preferred the familiar embrace of shorelines and navigable rivers. They sought places where their ships could patiently ride the waves, while their crews ventured ashore to assert their will. But this land, Samaland, offered none of that welcoming ease. When you look through the old Norse sagas, you'll notice a peculiar tone when these far northern regions are mentioned. They're spoken of carefully, almost evasively, often lacking the vivid detail usually found in their tales. It's like someone casually referencing a distant relative they secretly hope never darkens their door. The language feels vague, the descriptions minimal, not because the Vikings lacked curiosity, no, but because curiosity, even for them, had its boundaries, and those boundaries, you see, simply froze solid, somewhere far beyond the comforts they knew. The people of this land, the Sami, offered no fixed targets. They didn't live in clustered towns that could be surrounded and set ablaze. They didn't cultivate fields of grain waiting to be plundered. There were no grand fortifications to admire before their inevitable fall. Instead, They moved, always moving, quietly, with an unsettling assurance that bespoke a deep, intuitive knowledge of their world, a world where everyone else felt profoundly lost. For a Viking, this was utterly maddening. Their entire raiding strategy revolved around visible, fixed targets, ideally with brimming storage houses, herds of livestock, and the predictable surge of panic. But the Simi provided none of it. You could march tirelessly all day through this silent wilderness, only to find nothing but snow, trees, and a growing, unsettling suspicion that perhaps you were the one who had gotten it all wrong. Even their trade expeditions into these lands were handled with a striking difference. Vikings moved through these northern territories with a quiet caution, a newfound respect, and almost always with local guides. They would never arrive with boasts or grand announcements. They never lingered a moment longer than absolutely necessary, and they certainly would never, ever, wander off alone, a solitary act that, for a Viking, was usually a clear sign that something was already terribly, deeply amiss. The Simi, it seemed, existed outside the rules everyone else knew. They not only survived where Vikings simply struggled, but they navigated this trackless terrain as if guided by an invisible thread. They would appear and then vanish without a trace, without explanation. It was as if the very land itself recognized them as its own and gently but firmly rejected everyone else. And this, more than anything, was what truly unsettled the Norse. They weren't afraid of people who lived beyond the known edges of their maps. They were afraid of people who made the map itself utterly meaningless, because once your reliable map ceases to function, once its lines and markers lose their purpose, then even the greatest strength begins to feel very small indeed. And Vikings understood this truth deep in their bones. The Vikings, you see, preferred enemies they could clearly identify and confidently blame a rival chieftain, a stubborn monarch, or even just a monk who dared to look at them askance. What truly disquieted them was an adversary that simply could not be pierced by a blade, or silenced by a shouted command, or definitively vanquished in a dramatic duel. Sami territory presented precisely that problem. The very land itself seemed to hold a quiet resentment for visitors. The forests were so incredibly dense, so interwoven, they muffled every sound, turning even the most forcefully shouted orders into awkward, strained whispers that seemed to melt away into the trees, going nowhere. The snow, too, swallowed noise, absorbing it completely, like a vast, silent conspiracy. You could be marching with a company of heavily armed warriors, feeling the steady crunch of footsteps, yet still experience an unnerving sensation of being profoundly, uncomfortably, alone, hardly the state of mind one desires just before a battle. Then there was the cold. Oh, Vikings respected the cold. They lived with it, understood its bite. But this was a different realm entirely. This was a cold that punished every slightest misstep instantly. Take a wrong stride, and your foot would plunge into snow far deeper than you anticipated, pulling you down. Move too quickly, and your body would betray you by sweating, and that sweat, moments later, would turn to ice beneath your clothes, a chilling, personal betrayal by your own garments. Even the familiar Viking armor, usually a proud symbol of their might, here became a heavy liability. The cumbersome gear slowed every movement. Shields would constantly snag on low branches, spears would catch amongst the trees, and axes, usually so effective, felt suddenly less useful when every powerful swing required space you simply did not possess. The ancient forest, you realize, cared nothing for how brave you were. It only cared if you could fit between its silent, watchful trees. Navigation was an even deeper challenge. Any familiar landmarks simply vanished beneath a fresh blanket of snow. Tracks, however distinct, disappeared completely overnight, as if wiped clean by an unseen hand. Even the sky seemed to refuse its guiding role, remaining a vast, flat, featureless canvas of gray that made any sense of direction feel less like a firm rule and more like a fleeting suggestion. Vikings prided themselves on their mastery of the open sea, their ability to read the stars and waves. Yet here, land navigation felt like being quietly, subtly mocked by nature itself. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through this very same landscape as if strolling through their own home. They intuitively knew which snow would bear their weight and which would treacherously swallow them whole. They understood the intricate dance of how sound traveled, how the wind shifted its breath, how the animals moved through their unseen paths. To the Vikings, this appeared suspiciously like magic. To the land itself, however, it was simply competence. And that imbalance, that profound difference in understanding, truly mattered. A typical Viking raid relied on an unstoppable surge of momentum, swift speed, a sudden shock, and the predictable spread of fear. All of these vital elements, you understand, simply evaporated the moment the environment chose not to cooperate. Marching inland became an agonizingly slow process. Camps, once secure, now felt exposed and vulnerable. Even their fires, usually a comforting flicker, became brightly visible beacons in a world that otherwise shrouded everything in a cloak of concealment. Worst of all, the land never offered a dramatic warning of danger. There were no clear signs, no thunderous buildup, just the slow, creeping realization that you were growing tired, perhaps a little lost, undeniably cold, and subtly, yet certainly, being observed by someone who was experiencing none of these difficulties. The land, you see, didn't need to actively fight the Vikings. It simply removed their familiar advantages and waited. And when the very environment itself seems to be an ally of your enemy, even the most formidable courage begins to feel a lot like very poor planning. The Vikings, in their own way, expected their enemies to behave rather politely. By that, I mean they anticipated their adversaries would stand somewhere visible, perhaps even shouting a defiant challenge, so that everyone knew precisely where the violence would begin. Even their ambushes followed certain unspoken, almost theatrical rules. Someone would rush out, someone would inevitably shout, someone would make a mistake loudly enough for all to hear. What the Vikings absolutely did not expect was to be attacked by people who, it seemed, simply had no desire to be seen at all. In Sami territory, fights didn't start, they simply occurred, A man might be walking, his mind perhaps wandering to something entirely trivial, when suddenly he was no longer walking. Arrows would arrive without a whisper of warning, without a single sound, and without the slightest courtesy of revealing who had loosed them. One moment there was a cohesive group, the next a bewildered confusion, shouts of alarm, and someone asking the very reasonable, yet ultimately unanswerable, question: where did that come from? The chilling answer was almost always everywhere and nowhere. Sami hunters possessed an understanding of concealment that the Vikings found deeply, profoundly annoying. Their white clothing dissolved seamlessly into the snow-covered landscape. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. They utilized the terrain around them as if it were an extension of their own body. Vikings, in stark contrast, wore darker clothes, carried clanking metal, and made noise simply by existing. Stealth, you see, was simply not their strong suit. Subtlety made them restless and uneasy, and these attacks were never decisive in the dramatic, glorious sense they craved. There was no grand clash, no clear, triumphant victory, just a relentless, constant pressure. A warrior wounded here, a supply carrier quietly disappearing there, camps disturbed during the dark hours of the night, equipment sabotaged so subtly, so silently, as if imagine the quiet frustration as the very landscape seemed to conspire against you, making supplies vanish or paths disappear. This wasn't the kind of honorable battle your ancestors had taught you. You were accustomed to meeting an enemy head-on, fighting with clear purpose, claiming your victory, and then moving on. But this was a slow, creeping weariness, a quiet war waged on your spirit, eroding your strength and patience, not just shedding blood. And the most unsettling part, there was never a moment to strike back. Charging blindly into the whispering forest offered no solution. Shouting defiant threats into the empty air felt hollow. Even the satisfying thud of your axe against a tree trunk, though momentarily easing your temper, accomplished nothing tangible. The Sami, you see, didn't need to stand and fight. They simply chose when to manifest and when to melt away, allowing your company to exhaust yourselves, to wander lost, to slowly succumb to suspicion. Every twig snapping underfoot began to sound like a warning. Every deepening shadow seemed to watch you personally. Eventually, you found yourselves doing something truly unexpected. You stopped moving forward, not because you'd been vanquished in a grand clash, but because your adversary simply wouldn't be their long enough to defeat. And for a culture built on the rhythm of battle, nothing is quite as unsettling as a fight that simply refuses to materialize on its own terms. Now, in our modern world, if you hear tales of Vikings accusing someone of magic, you might interpret it as a vivid turn of phrase, a poetic way of saying things went terribly wrong, a metaphor, perhaps. But for the Vikings, magic wasn't an abstract concept or a figure of speech. It was a tangible, perfectly logical explanation for events that simply defied ordinary understanding. And the Sami, to the enduring discomfort of Viking minds, had a remarkable talent for making things not behave properly. Your own Norse sagas would tell of the Sami as sorcerers, capable of shifting their forms, conjuring storms, and weaving potent curses. You might recall accounts of sudden, blinding snowstorms, or mists that would roll in at the precise moment to obscure your path. Imagine travelers becoming utterly disoriented for no discernible reason, walking confidently for hours in precisely the wrong direction. For you, deeply aware of a world teeming with unseen spirits and forces, these weren't mere coincidences. They felt deliberate, intended. You might picture Sami shamans, their voices rising in rhythmic chants, the steady thrum of drums echoing in the hushed wilderness as they entered trance rituals that appeared profoundly disquieting to outsiders. They would journey into altered states, communing with unseen spirits, claiming insights into realms no ordinary person could perceive. And you, having your own traditions of cider, a form of subtle magic, recognized power when it manifested. But to acknowledge a potent force without truly grasping its nature, without a clear path to control it, is a profoundly unsettling experience. What made this even more unnerving was the quietude of this magic. It didn't announce itself with grand, dramatic displays. There were no obvious theatrics. It worked silently, subtly, weaving its influence in ways that a sword could never counter. How could you stab the curling mist? How could you challenge disorientation to a duel? What good was shouting when you simply found yourself utterly, inexplicably lost? Among all these strange powers, the manipulation of weather might have been the most deeply terrifying. A storm at sea, you understood. The wild, unpredictable ocean was a force to be respected. But a storm conjured inland, timed with chilling precision to halt your march or snuff out your flickering campfire, felt intensely personal. The mere notion that a person could influence the very sky above you was enough to cause even the most stalwart warriors to pause, to hesitate. And hesitation, once it takes root, spreads like a chill wind through a camp. Once one man begins to whisper of a curse, the others instinctively start noticing every small misstep. Every stumble becomes a sign, every delay a dark omen. Your group would begin to interpret simple bad luck as deliberate malice from unseen hands. This wasn't cowardice, not in your world. It was a logical conclusion, given your understanding of reality. The Sami didn't need to fell many of your kin with weapons. They only needed you to believe they possessed the power to strike you down without ever appearing. And in such a land, belief held more weight than mere physical reality. When an enemy threatened your body, you stood and fought. But when an enemy could attack your very understanding of the world, when they could unravel the fabric of your certainty, then withdrawal became the only sensible course. For what courage can avail you when it seems the universe itself has turned against you? And from your Viking perspective, in the lands of the Sami, that certainly felt to be the truth. Now, if you had simply considered the Sami to be merely peculiar, that might have been something you could manage. You encountered strange things all the time in your travels. What truly deepened the unease was that your own deep-seated mythology seemed to silently affirm these suspicions. Because in the rich tapestry of Norse tradition, even Odin, the All-Father himself, god of war, keeper of wisdom, master of poetry, and, yes, perhaps a figure of questionable parenting, did not possess all knowledge. And some of the profound insights he acquired, he found in the deep north. Your myths whispered of Odin traveling cloaked in disguise, seeking wisdom from outsiders, from shamans, from beings dwelling at the very edges of conventional society. As time passed, and as scholars reflected on these stories, these mysterious figures often bore a striking resemblance to Sami shamans, masters of trance, visionaries, travelers between spirit worlds, keepers of secret knowledge. These were not people who ruled kingdoms or commanded armies, and yet their presence could make even kings profoundly uneasy. This detail resonated with immense significance for you. Odin was not a god who sought assistance casually. He sacrificed an eye for insight. He endured 9 days suspended from Yggdrasil to unlock the runes. He was willing to suffer, to employ cunning, to question tirelessly, all in pursuit of knowledge. So, the very notion that even he would seek wisdom from these northern shamans sent an unequivocal message to your people. If Odin himself needed their insights, then these were not ordinary folk, and you, as Vikings, paid close attention to what gave your gods pause. The Sami engaged in spiritual practices that you, as a Viking, might recognize elements of shamanic journeys, the guidance of spirit animals, acts of divination, the intimate knowledge of weather patterns. Yet these were powers you could not fully control, nor fully comprehend. To the Norse, these practices edged perilously close to cider, a powerful and unsettling form of magic already considered fraught with social risk. Even Odin's own engagement with *SEI Dr. was a point of controversy, which should tell you just how profoundly uncomfortable it made people. You, as a warrior, respected raw strength. You admired unwavering courage. You even held a certain regard for a clever adversary. But what you truly feared was a power that simply could not be measured, could not be grasped. The Sami didn't govern vast territories. They commanded no armies. They erected no grand monuments. And yet, their subtle influence quietly permeated the very fabric of Norse cosmology, like a persistent footnote that demanded attention. This indistinct boundary between ancient myth and the palpable reality before you was deeply disquieting. It hinted that the Sami were more than just another tribe. They were a people existing, perhaps halfway between worlds, human enough for you to trade with, yet dangerously potent enough to avoid, and so profoundly mysterious that they could even instruct the gods themselves. And when your very god of war regards a people as teachers rather than targets, you do not simply charge forward with a shout. You pause, you listen, you hesitate, and then, with quiet purpose, you might gently guide your longship in a different direction. Because if Odin himself approached them with such circumspection, then perhaps, just perhaps, you should too. You see, one of the most profoundly unsettling aspects of the Sami, from your Viking perspective, wasn't what they might perceive a stark difference in their approach, in what they consciously avoided. You see, they never launched sudden attacks. They didn't arrive by sea, torching homes and seizing people, only to later craft grand sagas of their exploits. To a Viking, observing this was utterly bewildering, almost unsettlingly strange. Their world, after all, revolved around claiming territory, holding it fiercely, and defending it with boisterous challenges. If you resided in a place and didn't strive for more, didn't yearn to expand your dominion, you were either disingenuous or operating on a plane entirely beyond their comprehension. Consider for a moment that the Sami didn't erect static settlements to be besieged, nor did they cultivate fields ripe for taking. Their true riches journeyed with them, their reindeer herds, their deep understanding of the land, their ancestral wisdom, and the rhythms of the turning seasons. You simply couldn't set ablaze what steadfastly refused to stand still. You couldn't seize what seemed to melt into the embrace of the forest before your very words had ceased. This fluid existence rendered them impervious to the usual methods of fear. You see, the Viking way was to instill terror, to appear suddenly, to roar and demonstrate their might, to watch as others crumbled in panic and then submitted. That was their established order. But the Sami, they wouldn't panic. They would simply recede, a quiet tide pulling back, only to reappear later, once the intruders had departed, leaving the Vikings bewildered, chilled by the northern air, and left to ponder the futility of their efforts. This profound disinterest in claiming territory was deeply unsettling to Viking chieftains. An adversary who covets your land can be met on the battlefield, but one who desires nothing you possess becomes an enigma, impossible to bargain with. You'd find no point of leverage, no effective threat, no treasure grand enough to justify the immense effort. The Sami, you see, remained wholly unimpressed by the Vikings' formidable weaponry, their grand longships, or their fearsome renown. They had, after all, weathered countless generations of harsh winters, relentless hunger, and profound solitude without outside assistance, a mere band of boisterous outsiders, brandishing axes, registered not as an existential danger, but at most a fleeting nuisance. To a Viking, accustomed to being feared, this felt like a profound affront, a disrespectful dismissal, far more galling than outright hostility. Even more profoundly, the Sami grasped a truth the Vikings grappled with endlessly. The concept of land ownership loses all meaning if the very earth itself refuses to cooperate. You simply cannot dominate a place that withholds its sustenance from you. You cannot impose your will on the snow, the deep forests, or the wandering herds with mere laws and imaginary lines on a map. The Sami moved asterisk with asterisk the land, a part of its intricate dance. The Vikings, by contrast, attempted to asterisk impose asterisk their will upon it. And this fundamental divergence, this silent chasm, was everything. For nothing disorients a conquering spirit more swiftly than encountering those who simply do not care to be conquered at all. Now, understand that the Vikings were not entirely unreasonable individuals. They recognized the inherent value of exchange. In fact, you might say they cherished trade almost as fervently as they pursued conflict, which speaks volumes. And with the Sami, this commerce wasn't merely endured, it was actively, thoughtfully fostered. Luxurious furs, robust hides, majestic antlers, prized walrus ivory, and a bounty of other precious northern resources began their journey south, woven through the intricate networks of Sami trade routes. The Vikings coveted these commodities with an intense desire. They were immensely valuable, easily transportable, and imbued all involved with a pleasant sense of sophistication. And so, the trading unfolded, a quiet, courteous affair, notably less punctuated by the clang of axes than was typical for their dealings. But here, a crucial distinction emerges. Trade expeditions unfolded in a manner strikingly divergent from their usual raids. When Vikings ventured into Sami lands for commerce, you wouldn't witness their typical swagger. They didn't boast, didn't bellow their proud genealogies for all to hear. Instead, they moved with local guides, meticulously adhered to established customs, presented thoughtful gifts, and most importantly, they listened. This wasn't precisely fear you were witnessing, but rather a profound respect, carefully interwoven with practical caution and ultimately sealed by a strong instinct for survival. Raiding, on the other hand, was an anomaly, a truly infrequent occurrence, and whenever the Vikings dared to attempt it, the outcomes were invariably disheartening. There exist no grand chronicles of triumph, no booming sagas glorifying vanquished Sami settlements, or tales of heroic plunder. Only nebulous mentions of setbacks, thwarted journeys, and expeditions that returned prematurely, with fewer warriors and a diminished sense of bravado which, in the Viking tradition of storytelling, approaches the closest thing you'd find to an outright admission of defeat. You should understand that the Sami were anything but vulnerable traders waiting to be exploited. They held the reins of their domain. They possessed an intimate knowledge of where the vital resources lay, which valleys became treacherous snares for the unwary, and which rivers vanished silently beneath a cloak of ice. A Viking engaged in trade wisely heeded this Sami wisdom. A Viking set on raiding, however, chose to disregard it. You can well imagine which path led to a longer life. Even more disquieting, Sami traders conducted themselves not as frightened supplicants. They negotiated with quiet composure. They dictated terms. They serenely declined any agreements that didn't align with their interests, simply walking away without a trace of apprehension. The Vikings, accustomed to bullying their way to advantageous outcomes, found their usual tactics utterly useless here. You simply cannot coerce those who hold no fixed possessions to lose. This distinct power dynamic forged an unspoken understanding. Commerce was agreeable, but violence was unequivocally not worth the considerable effort. And when a culture intrinsically designed for raiding concludes that a target isn't worth the plunder, that realization stems from a profound and often painful learning experience. It wasn't that the Vikings truly feared the Sami as direct enemies. No, their apprehension stemmed from the Sami's uncanny ability to render their very method of raiding utterly inefficient. And for a Viking, inefficiency itself was a deeply terrifying prospect. They favored landscapes that seemed to cooperate with their approach. Sweeping coastlines, navigable rivers, wide open fields where any threat was clearly visible, allowing for swift and decisive action. Forests, by contrast, already held a certain unease for them. But these northern forests, you understand, were something else entirely. They didn't merely stand passively by. They seemed to actively participate in the unfolding drama. The moment Vikings pushed inland into Sami lands, everything they had always depended upon ceased to function as it should. Their magnificent longships became mere decorative ornaments, beached far away on the coast, offering no solace or support. Their sturdy horses floundered, their vital supply lines stretched precariously thin, fraying with every step. Suddenly, the fearsome Norse warrior was simply a man burdened by too much gleaming metal in a place that seemed to quietly resent its very presence. Their armor, typically a gleaming emblem of strength, transformed into an exhausting, suffocating weight. Their shields, designed for battle, continually snagged on low-hanging branches. Their spears, meant for piercing foes, struck only the impassive trunks of trees. Their axes, formidable in open combat, demanded a swing radius that simply didn't exist in this dense environment. Every single step they took produced a telltale crunch, a rustle, a sound that echoed like an open announcement. Vikings were masters of imposing their presence, of crafting intimidation. They were, however, utterly inept at being quiet. The forest, conversely, was a profound expert in silence. The thick snow seemed to swallow sound whole, rendering shouts utterly meaningless. Commands dissipated into the vast emptiness. You could stand merely 10 paces from a fellow warrior and feel an overwhelming, profound isolation. And this kind of solitude in an alien landscape possesses a peculiar power to transform courage into weary irritation, and then irritation into a creeping dread. Meanwhile, the Sami glided through this very same forest as if it were a familiar, sun-dappled corridor. They instinctively knew which faint paths offered firm footing and which would betray you with hidden traps. They sensed the subtle movements of game, the whispered shifts in the wind, precisely where the snow might conceal or reveal a trail. To the Vikings, this deep, innate understanding of their surroundings, did you found it wasn't a matter of skill anymore. It felt different, as if the very forest had quietly, subtly chosen a side against you. Even your roaring campfires, once a beacon of safety, turned into a silent danger. Their smoke, a plume against the vast northern sky, betrayed your presence, and the light, which you thought contained, seemed to stretch and carry much farther than you ever anticipated in this unfamiliar land. A camp that felt perfectly secure as dusk settled could, by the crisp light of dawn, feel utterly exposed, vulnerable. Each morning brought quiet, unsettling confirmations that you weren't alone. A disturbed trail, a piece of equipment subtly gone, footprints that appeared and then simply vanished, almost as if teasing your senses. The forest itself never launched a direct assault. It didn't need to. Instead, it worked upon you in more insidious ways, slowing your every step, draining your resolve, whispering doubts into your mind, turning your carefully laid plans into mere suggestions rather than firm commands. And with each passing day you remained, this subtle pressure seemed to grow, tightening around you, quietly wearing you down. Eventually, even the most steadfast among you, those hardened by countless triumphs, began to feel a quiet unease, a gnawing suspicion that your usual methods, your sheer strength, were no longer the right answer here. For a culture built on the very idea of domination, to encounter an environment utterly uninterested in being subdued, the true response wasn't a roar of anger. It was a silent, strategic withdrawal. You didn't lose grand battles within the forest's embrace. No, you simply lost something far more critical, your momentum. And that, in its own way, was a deeper, more profound defeat. You didn't need the horror of mass casualties to learn this lesson. All that was truly needed were whispers, quiet tales, and these stories. Unfortunately, for your legendary confidence traveled with an unseen speed, far outpacing even your swift longships, a raid that simply faded into quiet failure without a trace of glorious combat proved far more unsettling and dangerous than any loud, resounding defeat. When your returning warriors stepped onto shore without the usual glint of trophies, without the booming sagas of conquest, and most strikingly, without any clear explanation for their empty hands, you noticed. You, a people renowned for your storytelling, for narrating every triumph, every setback, every insult, even your regrettable decisions, found that silence was now the most unsettling tale of all. Men returned with fewer faces beside them than they had set out with. Their words were vague, speaking of bad land, of strange weather, of journeys that simply didn't go well. They skillfully sidestepped any direct questions, shifting the conversation with an almost unnatural grace. And truly, nothing could make the air in a bustling longhouse feel heavier, more uncomfortable than a Viking warrior who steadfastly refused to brag about his exploits. Around the warmth of the fires, and within the shadowed eaves of the great longhouses, a new kind of story began to quietly spread. Not the grand, heroic sagas you knew so well, but soft, cautious warnings. Do not travel too far inland. Do not venture without a local guide. Avoid camping in that particular place. Such careful advice was almost unheard of in your culture, where the usual counsel was simply, bring more axes. And then, there was the deepening silence surrounding the men who simply vanished. No heroic deaths to recount. No bodies to bring home and honor. Just a terrifying, empty absence. This void, this lack, was more unsettling than any wound, for it left vast, dark spaces for your imagination to fill. And your imagination, you knew, could conjure terrors far more cruel than any reality. A warrior fallen in battle was a fate you understood, a sorrow you could grasp. But a man who simply ceased to be, without explanation, invited every dark, unpleasant theory to swarm forth at once. Rumors, like a creeping mist, did the rest. Some whispered that the very forest consumed people whole. Others claimed the indigenous folk, the Sami, possessed the power to summon blinding storms, or subtly cloud a warrior's mind. Some insisted that ancient spirits would lead travelers in endless circles until exhaustion claimed them entirely. The precise details of these tales might shift and change, but the underlying conclusion remained chillingly consistent. There was something about that land, a silent, pervasive power that was simply not worth challenging. These stories were never shouted, never boasted. They were shared carefully, quietly, with a profound seriousness that utterly stifled any jest or lightheartedness. And when the laughter and the jokes finally ceased, you knew, deep down, that fear had already found its silent victory. Your younger warriors, usually so eager for glory, now listened intently, their faces uncharacteristically grave. Your sagacious leaders began to subtly adjust their planned routes, their wisdom guiding them away from the interior. Your traders, typically bold, became noticeably more circumspect. Maps, though unchanged on parchment, were silently redrawn in the collective consciousness, not with ink, but with the quiet, persistent force of new habits. Your ships, once charting courses toward the northern wilds, now subtly veered elsewhere. Your expeditions sought out gentler, safer targets. No grand announcement was ever uttered. You, the Vikings, did not proclaim your fear. Instead, you simply stopped going. This, you began to understand, was the true, pervasive way that fear spread, not through a sudden, roaring panic, but through the quiet, incremental shifts in habit, through choices that subtly altered, through familiar paths no longer trodden, through lands that quietly became someone else's distant problem. The Sami had no need for vast armies to defend their territories. They required no towering walls or fluttering banners. All they truly needed was their formidable reputation. And once such a reputation takes root within a warrior culture like yours, it becomes an almost impossible force to dislodge. For you could always defeat an enemy with blade and shield. But defeating a story, a pervasive, whispered narrative, that was a challenge of an entirely different magnitude. You, the Vikings, never formally announced your fear. There was no proud proclamation, no solemn council decree, no dramatic oratorical speech declaring, "We shall never venture north again." Such an admission would have been a profound humiliation, a wound to your very identity. Instead, you did not formalize this fear. You simply practiced it, silently, profoundly. Fear manifested itself in quiet absences. Certain familiar routes were no longer traveled. Specific hunting grounds, once rich, suddenly became inconvenient. Certain ambitious journeys were postponed indefinitely, a phrase which, in your unspoken lexicon, simply meant absolutely not. Your maps were not erased, but in those northern reaches, they grew noticeably vague, filled with empty, suggestive spaces where intricate details should have been etched. And when you inquired about those regions, you were met with a casual shrug, a short, clipped reply, or a story that simply drifted to an abrupt, uncomfortable end. This quiet shift in behavior, you understood, carried immense weight. You were not a subtle people. You celebrated your victories with booming shouts and mourned your losses with dramatic wails. So, when something truly instilled dread within you, the very absence of noise, the profound quiet, became the most powerful signal of all. Fear, you discovered, did not always roar. Sometimes it merely whispered, and everyone, without a single spoken word, listened. No one, not even the most ambitious among you, ever boasted of venturing deep into Sami territory. No one sought or claimed glory from those lands. Your young, eager warriors were no longer encouraged to test their mettle in those forbidding regions. Instead, your revered elders, those whose long lives had imbued their opinions with immense weight, now quietly steered them toward safer targets, along closer coasts, toward easier, more predictable prey. And in your society, the wisdom of an elder was never, ever dismissed lightly. Even your grand sagas, the very chronicles of your deeds, subtly echoed this pervasive discomfort. The Sami would appear within them only briefly, strangely, often without clear explanation, described always with a noticeable distance, as if merely naming them too directly might somehow attract their unseen attention. Your storytelling, usually bursting with vivid detail, biting insult, and glorious exaggeration, now showed a remarkable, almost unsettling, restraint in this specific context. This, you knew, was not how you crafted tales about enemies you felt confident in crushing. Your fear also subtly reshaped your very etiquette. When you encountered Sami traders or guides, your demeanor shifted noticeably. Less shouting, you found, more attentive listening, a deeper, more pronounced respect. It was the kind of deference that didn't stem from a sense of equality, but rather from a profound, unsettling uncertainty. You treated people with utmost care when you were simply unsure of the true extent of their hidden power. And so, this pervasive fear gradually settled into a quiet, unwavering routine. Your ships now sailed to distant, different shores. Your ambitious expeditions quietly turned back earlier than planned. The northern borders remained undefined, a shimmering, unspoken line you simply did not cross. No one truly needed to articulate these changes aloud, for your collective behavior spoke volumes. The vast north remained quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was so thoughtfully, persistently avoided. The Sami themselves did not actively chase you away. They did not issue open threats or engage in any grand conquest. They simply remained steadfast and unchanged, while your formidable Viking attention, drawn by unseen forces, quietly drifted elsewhere. And in a culture that defined itself through bold action and dramatic deeds, that pervasive, quiet avoidance became the loudest, most undeniable admission possible. Fear, you learned, does not always scream its presence. Sometimes it merely rearranges your carefully laid plans. The Sami, in the end, did not defeat you in any traditional, violent sense. There was no decisive, thundering battle where shields shattered and songs of triumph or defeat were sung. Imagine the grand sagas you've heard, tales of legendary warriors, but the true events, the ones quietly unfolding far to the north, were often recorded differently, if at all, long after the deeds were done. You wouldn't find a dramatic scene of a great Viking chieftain falling poetically in the deep snow, uttering a final, stirring cry. Such a clear, heroic end would have been simpler for the Viking mind to grasp, fitting perfectly into their understanding of the world. Instead, the people of the Sami lands presented a challenge far more subtle and far more unsettling. They simply remained beyond reach. Their strength wasn't found in overwhelming numbers, nor did they wield weapons of superior design. They didn't crash into Viking forces with brute physical might. What they possessed was something the Vikings found profoundly difficult to contend with: the deep-seated ability to exist free from control. The Sami never lingered long enough in one place to be conquered. Their temporary homes moved with the seasons, their precious belongings journeyed with them, and their entire way of life revolved around the rhythm of animals, the whisper of the wind, and the secrets of roots only they fully understood. You see, the Vikings couldn't corner them, couldn't encircle them, couldn't force them into the kind of direct clash they knew how to win. This was deeply frustrating. Vikings preferred clear-cut problems with tangible solutions: forge more ships, gather more warriors, strike harder. But how do you strike someone who simply isn't there? when you arrive? How do you instill fear in people who can effortlessly melt away into a landscape that seems to actively resent your very presence? Every advantage the Vikings thought they possessed slowly evaporated the deeper they pushed inland. The weight of their heavy armor became a burden, slowing their progress. Their loud, deliberate movements echoed through the silent forests, announcing their approach. Their mighty longships, symbols of their power, became utterly useless, left far behind, and their supply lines, stretched thin over vast, unforgiving terrain, grew dangerously fragile. Meanwhile, the Sami lost none of their innate advantages. They moved with silent swiftness, carrying only what was essential, relying on their profound understanding of the land rather than brute force. From a Viking perspective, this felt profoundly unfair. And that feeling of unfairness, that quiet inability to gain purchase, was often misinterpreted as an insidious danger. The Sami didn't need to triumph in a single battle. Their goal was simply to make the Viking presence incredibly expensive, utterly exhausting, and ultimately entirely unrewarding. And as the seasons turned, this quiet, persistent strategy worked perfectly. Viking leaders, accustomed to decisive victories, slowly began to ask much more practical questions. What, they wondered, do we truly gain from this? What price are we paying in men and resources? Is any of this genuinely worth the effort? These sober inquiries rarely concluded with shouts of enthusiasm. The Sami were not an enemy you could simply defeat. They were more like an element of the environment itself, something you simply had to endure. And the Vikings, you can imagine, already faced enough challenges just enduring the harsh natural world around them. So, the Vikings did precisely what any rational, experienced warrior culture does. When confronted with an opponent it cannot dominate, they quietly disengaged. They turned their attention to easier targets, to richer lands, to softer, more vulnerable coasts, places where victory brought tangible spoils and rousing sagas, rather than the quiet misery of frostbite and utter confusion. The Sami were not terrifying because they actively slew Vikings in droves. They were terrifying because they utterly refused to be controlled. And for a culture built on the very foundation of domination, control held a far greater significance than mere victory. For all their boisterous shouting, their swift raids, and their enthusiastic axe swinging, the Vikings were not foolish, reckless, yes, absolutely, loud, undeniably so, but stupid. No, not at all. They paid keen attention to patterns, especially patterns that involved warriors not returning home. While the Viking world deeply prized raw courage, it also held a profound respect for hard-won experience. And experience, you'll find, has a quiet way of drawing clear boundaries. Certain treacherous seas were avoided entirely during the bitter winter months. Certain isolated coasts were only raided once, their meager spoils not warranting a return. Certain winding rivers were approached with calculated caution, and those vast, distant lands, far to the north, slowly, subtly, earned a reputation that dampened even the most ardent Vikings' enthusiasm. This wasn't a defeat in the conventional sense. It was a cold, hard calculation. Viking leaders grasped a crucial truth. Not every place was worth the immense effort required. Raiding, after all, worked best when the rewards were clear and the resistance behaved predictably. Monasteries, with their gleaming treasures, were perfect. Thriving towns, excellent. Wealthy coasts, practically begging for their attention. But Sami territory offered none of that. No bustling cities to plunder, no hoards of gold to seize, no terrified populations waiting to be exploited. just endless, cold forests and a quiet, resilient people who simply refused to cooperate. So, as the years passed, Viking attention quietly shifted elsewhere, not because they were driven out, but because they simply chose not to return. Their usual routes were adjusted, their intended targets reconsidered. Expeditions were planned with a little more realism and a little less boundless optimism. This was Viking pragmatism in its purest form. They understood deeply that bravery without tangible reward was utterly pointless. A warrior who died gloriously but achieved nothing useful was, in the end, still quite dead. And dead men, you see, do not raid again. Leaders who consistently sent their men into hostile lands without profit rarely remained leaders for long. So, the Vikings adapted. They learned to respect limits, even if they never openly admitted to fear. The far north gradually became a place you traded with carefully, traveled through cautiously, and spoke about vaguely in hushed tones. No grand banners were planted, no triumphant victories declared. There was only a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that some places simply resisted domination without ever needing to directly fight for it. This recognition was profoundly un-Viking in its nature, and that, you might say, is precisely why it mattered so much. The Vikings didn't harbor a belief in their own invincibility. What they believed in, above all else, was practicality. When faced with something that simply refused to break, they moved on. They didn't romanticize failure. They actively avoided it, and in doing so, they revealed a facet of their character rarely discussed. The Vikings weren't fearless because they lacked fear entirely. They were fearless because they possessed the wisdom to choose when fear was genuinely worth listening to. And in the subtle, persistent case of the Sami, fear was whispering something very sensible indeed: stay away. In the final reckoning, the Sami didn't terrify the Vikings by defeating them on a battlefield, or by slaughtering them, or by humiliating them in a glorious display of arms. That kind of outcome would have been easy to comprehend, fitting neatly into the Viking mental filing cabinet labeled "problems we will fix with more axes." Instead, the Sami terrified the Vikings by their very refusal to be controlled. They simply did not play by Viking rules. They did not wage war in the Viking way. They built no cities for the Vikings to conquer, nor cultivated fields for them to seize. They lived lightly upon the land, moved with complete freedom, and relied on a profound, intimate knowledge of their world rather than brute force. And in this quiet, unassuming manner, they subtly dismantled everything the Vikings relied upon to feel powerful. The Vikings were true masters of domination. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that the world could be shaped and bent to their will through sheer strength, through the installation of fear, and through the cultivation of a fearsome reputation. And for much of the world, they were often right. But the Sami world utterly resisted such shaping. It absorbed Viking violence without ever responding in predictable ways. It transmuted Viking strength into weary exhaustion, and Viking confidence into seething irritation. That, for the Vikings, was truly terrifying. For them, fear wasn't about the certainty of death. They expected death, and welcomed it, at least in theory, when it came gloriously. No, fear for the Vikings was about uncertainty. It was about situations where immense effort did not guarantee any discernible results, about places where their renowned courage failed to translate into effective control. The Sami, in their quiet, elusive way, embodied all of that. They were not louder than the Vikings. They were not richer. They were not more overtly aggressive. They were simply, profoundly impossible to dominate. And that, in the end, is why Viking interest gently faded. Not with rage, not instead of meeting them with open combat. Imagine a strategy of quiet resilience, a gentle turning away. History often praises those who conquer, but it can sometimes overlook the profound strength found in simply enduring. The people of the Sami didn't need to overpower the Vikings. They merely needed to patiently outlast them, and that is precisely what they did. Their ancestral lands remained theirs. Their unique culture continued to weave its intricate tapestry, and their way of life persisted long after the Viking longships turned their attention to other shores. So, while you might hear tales of Vikings being feared across Europe, remember that even they encountered something that stirred a quiet apprehension within them. They encountered a people who could not be truly conquered, a landscape that would not bend to their will, and the unsettling understanding that not every challenge could be overcome by brute force. Sometimes, the most profound victory is found in the simple refusal to surrender. As the sun gently slipped below the rooftops of ancient Edo, you'd notice the city didn't merely quiet down. Instead, it began to awaken to a different kind of energy, sharpening its appetite for the night. The orderly daytime world of quiet shops, dignified samurai processions, and well-defined routines softened, giving way to something more vibrant, wetter, and deeply fragrant. Delicate paper lanterns began to glow, blossoming along the narrow streets like luminous, ethereal fruit. The evening rain would slick the packed dirt roads, transforming your footsteps into soft, rhythmic splashes. Everywhere, you'd see tendrils of smoke curling upward, not from hearths nestled within homes, but from dozens of small charcoal fires, carefully carried, gently pushed, or propped up by vendors who intuitively understood precisely when the city's hunger would strike the hardest. This was the quiet, authentic beginning of Edo's night markets. Not sprawling plazas or grand, formal bazaars, but intimate, winding streets. The serene approaches to bridges, the ancient gates of temples, and bustling ferry landings where people naturally paused and slowed their pace. Vendors would appear as if summoned by the very air of anticipation. Some would gently drag wooden carts behind them, their wheels softly murmuring on the wet ground. Others would balance shoulder poles, with pots swinging ever so slightly at each ends, faint wisps of steam trailing behind them like tiny, ephemeral ghosts. The entire city transformed into a vast, moving kitchen, and the air would grow thick with the comforting, complex aroma of soy sauce, rich fish fat, and the gentle, smoky warmth of burning charcoal. Eating here required no elaborate ceremony. You wouldn't sit, you wouldn't linger. Instead, you'd find yourself standing comfortably under the protective eaves, perhaps your sleeves rolled up, your sandals a little damp, chewing thoughtfully as the rain gently tapped a soft rhythm on your hat. This was food designed for quick satisfaction, immediate warmth, and deep contentment, perfect for the laborer concluding a long, arduous shift, for the messenger hurrying across the vast city, for travelers arriving as darkness fell, and yes, even for the samurai who might prefer not to be observed enjoying street food, but who absolutely did so anyway in quiet moments. Money would exchange hands with practiced ease. Copper coins would clink softly. A bowl would be passed, then slurped with a quiet enthusiasm, and swiftly handed back. Chopsticks would be wiped discreetly on a sleeve. No one ever asked for seconds, knowing that another tempting stall awaited just 10 steps further down the lantern-lit path. Edo was enormous, wonderfully crowded, and perpetually hungry, and these night vendors nourished it, one skewer and one comforting bowl at a time. What truly mattered most was the heat, the soothing warmth of your hands around a steaming bowl, the comforting warmth of broth in your stomach, the gentle warmth of smoke mingling with the cool, damp air. These night markets weren't about grand luxury or fleeting novelty. They were about the simple act of survival, made utterly delicious. In a city where most people lived in small, tightly packed wooden homes with strict rules against open flames, street food wasn't a guilty pleasure. It was a practical, safer, easier, and often far more delicious alternative to cooking at home. As the lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze and the rain continued its soft descent, Edo's streets transformed into a shimmering, fragrant ribbon of light and unforgettable smells. And once that very first charcoal fire was kindled, everyone knew, without a doubt, that the night had truly begun. If Edo's night markets had a soundtrack, it wasn't music in the conventional sense. It was a voice. A long, drawn-out, melodious call would echo down the winding streets, rising and falling with a rhythm like an ancient chant. That particular sound meant only one thing: soba was on its way. Long before the era of delivery apps or illuminated restaurant signs, dinner would announce its arrival by shouting politely and clearly through the gentle rain. Soba vendors were among the most mobile and instantly recognizable figures of Edo's nights. They didn't wait for customers to seek them out. Instead, they moved through the city, gently hunting for those ready to eat. Balanced across a sturdy shoulder pole, you would see two wooden boxes swaying, one carefully held bowls and delicate noodles, while the other contained a small charcoal stove with a pot of hot broth sloshing ever so gently as the vendor walked. With every steady step, a faint cloud of steam would rise into the damp air, carrying with it the comforting scent of soy, dried fish, and warm buckwheat. Soba was known to be fast, affordable, and incredibly filling, precisely what the bustling city demanded. The noodles were thin and possessed a subtle coarseness, boiled quickly, and then immersed in a simple, savory broth crafted from soy sauce and fish stock. There were no elaborate garnishes to boast about, no pretense of artistry, just pure, comforting speed. A customer would simply stop the vendor. Coins would be exchanged in a swift, practiced motion, and within moments, a steaming bowl would be ready. You would eat, standing comfortably under an awning or leaning against a bridge railing, slurping your noodles loudly, not because it was rude, but because it was the most practical and efficient way to enjoy them. The appeal of soba reached far beyond simple hunger. It offered a profound warmth, and Edo's nights were often quite damp. Winters could feel sharp and penetrating through thin robes, and even summer rains brought a chill to the skin. A bowl of hot noodles wasn't just comfort food in an emotional sense. It was truly survival food. Laborers consumed it to sustain their energy. Couriers ate it quickly between their routes, and travelers sought it out because it was familiar, reliably prepared, and unlikely to cause them any distress. Soba also held a unique reputation. It was common fare, certainly, but never considered shameful. Even samurai, officially expected to dine with utmost restraint and dignity, were known to quietly enjoy bowls in secluded alleyways, their swords resting casually against a nearby wall as they slurped with the same simple satisfaction as everyone else. The warming broth didn't discriminate by rank, and neither did the vendor. Everyone paid the exact same price. There was no formal seating, no expectation of privacy, and no lingering once the bowl was empty. it would be returned to its box. The vendor would wipe it clean with a swift motion, hoist the pole onto their shoulder once more, and continue their journey, their voice calling out into the soft darkness for the next customer. The meal itself left no trace, save for a gentle warmth spreading through the stomach and the fading echo of that familiar, comforting cry. In a sprawling city of nearly 1 million souls, these soba vendors were like invisible threads, stitching the night together, their voices carrying through the rain and the lantern light, transforming hunger into something audible, and, if only for a brief moment, deeply satisfied. Among all the tantalizing smells that would drift through Edo's night streets, none had the power to stop people in their tracks faster than that of eel. The rich, oily, utterly distinctive scent of *anagi, hitting hot charcoal, possessed a remarkable ability to cut through the rain, conversations, and even the most disciplined self-control. For a city accustomed to generally simple fare, grilled eel felt wonderfully, almost dangerously close to true indulgence, and that was precisely its allure. Eel was certainly not the cheapest food you could find in Edo, which only made its presence on the bustling street scene all the more impressive. Vendors would skillfully set up their small, glowing grills near the approaches to bridges, along quiet riverbanks, and at busy intersections where the flow of foot traffic never ceased. Live. As the evening deepens around you, you might find yourself drawn by a different kind of warmth, a scent that whispers promises of strength and satisfaction. Down a narrow lane, the air thickens, carrying the rich, savory perfume of something sizzling. Here, skilled hands work with an almost hypnotic rhythm, preparing the night's most celebrated fortifier. You watch as eels, handled with practiced ease, are quickly cleaned and then placed upon skewers. The moment the meat touches the grill, a gentle sizzle fills the air, and you can almost hear the fat dripping, releasing tendrils of thick, mouth-watering smoke that dance and swirl, inviting everyone nearby to pause. People instinctively slow their steps, and you might notice a soft glint of coins appearing from pouches. The seasoning is deceptively simple, yet profoundly impactful. A smooth, glistening glaze of soy sauce and a touch of sweetness is brushed onto the eel again and again as it cooks, slowly transforming the surface into a deep, glossy finish that gently clings to the tender flesh beneath. There's no need for plates or elaborate ceremony here. The experience is direct and immediate. A skewer, still warm from the grill, is handed directly to you, meant to be enjoyed standing in the open air. Your fingers might become a little sticky. Perhaps a sleeve might be sacrificed to a stray drop, but in these moments, no one seems to mind. Beyond its delectable taste, eel carries a quiet reputation, a promise of renewal. It's considered especially strengthening, a balm against the draining heat of summer. And Edo summers, you see, are truly brutal, humid, packed with people, and relentless in their intensity. Eating eel is believed to rekindle your energy, fortify your spirit, and keep you from faltering in the crowded streets. Whether its restorative powers are truly scientific hardly matters. The simple act of belief itself sells countless skewers, year after year. What truly makes this street eel remarkable is the tapestry of people who enjoy it. You'll see merchants, their day's work done, grabbing a skewer on their homeward path. Laborers, when their pockets allow, treat themselves to this small luxury. Travelers, weary from long journeys, find it a welcome indulgence. And even samurai, ever so subtly maintaining their dignity, stand just far enough from the bustling fire to savor every bite, pretending not to notice they are sharing the exact same simple pleasure as everyone else. Unlike the rush of daily life, eel invites you to an unhurried moment. You find yourself standing a little longer, chewing with a gentle deliberation, truly savoring the rich fat, the smoky essence, and the sweet glaze. For these brief, precious moments, the night market's usual speed fades, replaced by a deep sense of pleasure. In Edo, true luxury isn't always found on silver trays in private rooms. Sometimes it's simply a hot eel on a stick, eaten beneath the soft glow of a lantern, perhaps with the gentle hiss of rain on charcoal as the city hums its ceaseless melody around you. But not every hunger in Edo's night markets originates from an empty stomach. Some emerge from fatigue, from the chill of the evening, or simply from the quiet comfort of habit. This is where the world of sweets gently unfolds. After the smoky, salty flavors of noodles and eel, the vendors offering dumplings and other sweet treats provide a soothing counterpoint. They offer warmth, a sense of comfort, and a small, unburdened moment of pleasure that asks for nothing but your quiet enjoyment. You'll find dango vendors easily. Their stalls possess a softer charm. Their fires are smaller. Their smells more subtle. A gentle whisper rather than a shout. Rows of perfectly round rice dumplings, skewered neatly, are held over a soft heat, occasionally brushed with a delicate sweet soy glaze, or lightly dusted with fragrant roasted soybean flour. The aroma is quiet but utterly irresistible, especially when the rain begins its soft patter. Sweet, warm, and with a faint, comforting nuttiness, it draws people in without ever needing to raise its voice. Dango is a food for every soul in Edo. You'll see children gently tugging at sleeves for a taste, couples sharing skewers with quiet smiles, and older townsfolk favoring it because it's so easy to chew and gentle on the stomach. Unlike eel or noodles, these dumplings don't demand urgency. You can linger a little longer, chew with mindful slowness, allowing the gentle warmth to spread through you without the pressure of rushing back into the crowd. Other sweets follow this same comforting logic. Imagine soft, steamed buns filled with sweet bean paste, simple rice cakes, or tiny sugar-coated treats, all sold in small portions that fit perfectly in your hand. These aren't elaborate confections. Sugar, you see, is precious, and excess is quietly frowned upon. But a little sweetness, even a tiny amount, can stretch a long way in a city where daily life is often rigorous and repetitive. Sweets also carry a delicate social meaning. Offering someone a dumpling is a small kindness, a gentle gesture to soften a long walk or ward off the evening chill. Travelers might use them to pass the time while awaiting a ferry, and workers savor them as a well-earned reward after a late shift. Even samurai, once again quietly setting aside appearances, might be seen accepting a skewer with a brief, dignified nod before melting back into the shadows. Unlike other street foods, these sweets don't stain your hands with grease or fill the air with thick smoke. They feel cleaner, calmer, almost like a piece of home brought out into the public street, blurring the lines between the private and the public, transforming a busy thoroughfare into a brief, comforting resting place. In a city built on discipline and routine, these small, sweet foods offer something truly rare, a touch of gentleness. Under the soft glow of lantern light and the hush of falling rain, a warm dumpling on a stick is enough to slow the night, even if only for a few peaceful bites. If the hearty noodles are the backbone of Edo's night food, and the sweets its gentle comfort, then fish cakes are pure, unadulterated efficiency. These are foods designed to be eaten quickly, cleanly, without the need for a long pause, perfect for a city that never truly sleeps, even after dark. You'll find asterisk, KAMABOKO, asterisk, and other fish-based snacks appearing everywhere as night descends. Vendors typically set up near waterways, bridges, and ferry landings, places where fresh fish is easily sourced, and where crowds naturally gather, creating a constant flow of hungry souls. You can watch as white fish is meticulously pounded into a fine paste, then shaped by hand into firm, dense cakes. These can be prepared in various ways. Some are gently steamed, others lightly grilled to impart a subtle char, and a few are fried until a delicate crust forms on the outside. The aroma is subtle, but undeniably inviting, less aggressive than the savory eel, less comforting than the sweet dumplings. Fish cakes occupy a satisfying middle ground. They are salty, with a hint of sweetness, and dense enough to truly quell a rumbling hunger. They are ideal for those who have places to be, who live by the clock of the city. One bite, then another, and the skewer is gone. No bowl to return, no chopsticks to wipe clean, just sustenance eaten standing, and then, like the night itself, momentarily forgotten. As the night deepens, fried foods begin to join the vibrant mix, a trend that grew as oil became more accessible in urban cooking.